My guest today is Taylor Moore, author of the new novel Downrange. Taylor, welcome to the podcast.
Man, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, if someone hasn't yet heard about your debut novel Downrange, how would you describe the novel?
It's it's kind of an interesting book. It's sort of a modern day Western mixed with a uh more of an operator style thriller. It's a little bit different than what's out there, but it's a lot of fun.
And do you remember the original idea or impetus that led you to write Downrange?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because Downrange actually wasn't the first book or series with Garrett Cole that I was writing. I was originally writing more of a traditional spy thriller, more of a in the line of a Brad Thor, a Vince Flynn, that kind of a thing, and that's what I landed my literary agent with. But ultimately, Garrett Cole was a secondary character in that novel series. He kind of stole the show and rose to the top. And my agent was the first one who said, he said, "Man, I think that guy's your protagonist right there." And so, of course, no writer wants to hear that. Let's start from scratch and let's do something new. But that's exactly what we did. And so it wasn't an easy call, but it was definitely the right call. And I'm glad my agent had made that suggestion because that's what we did. And that's how Garrett came about. He was a secondary character in my first novel series.
And can you tell us about your writing journey that led you to writing and getting your debut novel published? Had you always wanted to write a novel?
So, that's another good question. I don't, the answer is I don't know. I wrote my first book about 20 years ago. And I always describe it as kind of like a person who says, I have this, bucket list thing of running a marathon. I guess it was sort of a bucket list thing for me to see if I could write a book. And so about 20 years ago when I was ranching, I just, pulled out my laptop and over the course of a few months wrote this book and never really even planned to do anything with it. I just sort of wanted to see if I could do it. And it was a young adult novel. And then when I was, fast forward, maybe 15 years or so, I was working in oil and gas. This is past working in the CIA and with military intelligence doing contract work. And I got back into writing. And again, I was writing another young adult novel. But it was when I really decided to do this full time is when I said, okay, well, kind of the right what you know. And that was the spy world and, doing counter narcotics, military stuff. And so that's when I kind of, really got serious about doing a series that I wanted to see if I could get published. And, but before that, yeah, I always liked writing. That was always sort of my thing, but I never really thought, oh, this is going to be something I do for a living like I am now.
And how much of yourself is in your character, Garrett Cole?
I think there's a lot. At first I didn't think that because if you read the novel, you'll see that Garrett, I'm kind of more of a clean cut guy. And, of course, I'm an intel guy. That was, I wore suits and, I was just a different look and feel than Garrett. Although we both had that background, Garrett's from a ranch in Texas. I'm from a farming ranch in Central Texas. And we both grew up with a certain way with horses and all that. And so it's a funny thing, although we don't necessarily look, he's kind of tattooed, has the beard, the hair, kind of looks like an undercover narc, somebody that is meant to blend in with the sort of rough sorts that he deals with. We don't necessarily look alike, but I think we have a lot in common in terms of personality. And it's a funny thing. I didn't really realize this, but my agent would read something. He'd be like, "Man, I can hear your voice through Garrett." And it wasn't until, really my agent had pointed that out that we had a lot in common. And so I like to jokingly say that, there's the, straight man in a comedy. And I feel like I'm the sort of Steve Martin with John Candy and Plane, Trains and Automobiles, throughout my life. And I feel like Garrett's sort of that same guy. He's sort of navigating life with all these crazy people around him and trying to just get through and do the right thing. And so I know that's probably not right. People probably describe me as the crazy person, but that's kind of how I feel whenever, and that's how Garrett is. He's just sort of navigating through, whether it be his dad or the CIA or whoever he's coming in contact with. There's always, he's just trying to get through it,
Well, you mentioned earlier your work with the CIA.
Uh-huh.
How did that impact the writing of the novel and your knowledge of that world?
It impacted it a lot because, originally I was writing a CIA character. And when my agent suggested we make this switch, I wasn't super comfortable with it because the spy world is sort of what I knew. And I knew counter narcotics from, sort of working with the military and doing contract work. But I knew it from a very different level, than that of a law enforcement officer. That's just a whole different world. It's a whole different mindset. But the concept actually worked out really cool in a way because, we'd work with FBI or whoever, and I always knew that they kind of looked at us, and not that I just anticipated. I have friends that would tell me like, "Here's what we think about you guys," and we don't trust you, or that kind of a thing. And because the CI world is a little bit gray, and the law enforcement world is black and white, and I thought, well, what would happen if you put this law enforcement guy into the CIA's world, and he has to navigate? He's sort of a black and white, law and order guy. You put him in that gray world of the CIA, that would be pretty fun. And it was fun to write. I think people are having a lot of fun reading it.
That sounds great. So you mentioned earlier about how you had this novel written and then you basically had to start from scratch focusing on Garrett Cole. So
Right.
once you did that, what was the writing process like? I mean, are you an outliner, someone who kind of outlines extensively, or did you just dive into the narrative?
So that's a funny thing. The first chapter that I wrote just to see if I could do it, because at first I told my agent, like, I don't know. Let me see this. The first chapter is actually about 50 pages into the book. And it was something, I say it was when I didn't know I could do this, I took a stab at it, and it was probably, the writing had flowed in a way that had never flowed before. And I kind of knew that I was onto something, that this was working, that this was sort of the right story to tell with the right protagonist. So in that line, I mean, that's kind of how I started. No, I didn't start with like, here's what's going to happen. I just said, can I write this character as a protagonist? And then I feel like I could. And then so from that point on, I do a little bit of outlining. People always laugh, like, do you follow, certain, and I was like, I keep meaning to do that. I just turned in book 2 to my editor in the series, and I say I keep meaning to do that, but then I guess if what I'm doing works, then I'll just keep with it. And so it's a very loose outline, and it's pure torture because I'll say like, well, I'm going to put my, I tell people I like to, I'd say, well, how do you come up with these ideas? And I just say, well, I think of something that's kind of cool, like it's cool to me. It's like it's exciting, and so like I said, it's this operator style thriller mixed with a modern Western. And I'm like, well, imagine taking this like Green Beret and put him on a horse, and he's got AR-15s and he's wearing a cowboy hat and he's got a Bowie knife. I mean, to me, it's just that like sounded cool. So I'll take like a concept and I'll think, well, what if you put this guy up against this guy? In some ways, it's like MMA. How it used to be in the old days, where it's like, let's get this jujitsu guy next to a sumo wrestler or something, and let's just see what happens. It was like the crazy thing, but so that's kind of what I do. It's kind of what I think, like, what would happen if Garrett went up against these people? What would happen? And so that's kind of how I do it. And that's how the stories are born. And I take maybe something that's relevant happening in the world, whether it's drug trafficking or something else. And, obviously, Afghanistan, that's a big part of the book, and it's a big part of book 2. And, it became super relevant, as of the last week or so.
Sure.
I mean, never to say that wasn't relevant, but, let's be honest, over the last 20 years, it sort of faded into the backdrop and something you'd see in the news every now and then. And, now it's completely relevant in a very sad way. But yeah, so I just take these things and mash them together, and somehow or another, the world of Afghanistan meshes together with the world in Texas, and it seems to come together pretty nicely. But it's strange, I know, but that's how it works.
That's great. Well, you mentioned the second novel. Are you starting to think about, or have you already started writing the third novel?
I need to get started on the third novel. I have, yeah. Well, but the book just came out, so I never realized, book 1, came out, and I'm waiting on edits for book 2. And then, so yeah, book 3, I need to get going on that. But I don't know if a lot of people know this. I didn't even know till this, the marketing and publicity that goes into marketing your book is a full-time job. And so that's been my full-time job for the last few weeks, just doing lots of interviews and podcasts, and writing my own articles and doing things like that to get the word out about Downrange. And so that's all part of it. But yeah, so I have, I think 5 or 6 sort of loosely outlined books in the series after Downrange, and one of them just, I just checked off the list because I'd send to my editor. And, but yeah, no, I've got lots planned for Garrett Cole, and so I'll need to get started on that pretty quick.
That's great. Well, what novels have you read recently that you enjoyed?
The funny thing is I don't read a lot of, I mean, it's sort of the Twilight Zone, part of being an author is that, you get in this thing because you love reading these things, and then you don't end up reading very much anymore because, well, I end up reading a lot of nonfiction because I'm always doing research for the next book. However, I'm a friends with Don Bentley, and I'm a big Don Bentley fan. So I started with Without Sanction. Now I'm reading the second in the series, and it's been really good. So that's probably the most recent fiction novel that I've read.
Sure. Well, what writing advice would you offer for those who are working on their own stories and novels, and specifically thrillers?
Yeah. There's a lot of advice, and it's always hard to narrow it down, but maybe I'll narrow it down to a couple of things. But one of the things I tell people a lot is that writing is a team sport. And, everybody has this sort of idea of the lone writer, in his office by himself. And there's a lot of that, there is, just because that's part of it. But you need good mentors. You need a good critique group. You need people to be there for you, to help lift you up, to celebrate your victories. But, on a mentoring level, or, just, somebody there to go, this is working or this doesn't work. And it can be, and that's a learned process to learn how to take constructive criticism, because a lot of times we want to fire back and go, well, I did this for this reason, but don't do that. I would say don't do it. I think it's a learning process. Just take whatever, whatever people give you. And if you think it's a good idea, use it. If you don't think it's a good idea, then don't use it. But take that criticism and at least mull it over and go, okay, well, let me take that into consideration. And for me personally, I have had the wonderful fortune of being in a critique group and having mentors that are 2 New York Times best-selling romance writers. And so for me as a thriller writer, there was a lot you could say, well, what do these guys know about writing thrillers? Well, they may not write thrillers specifically, but they're wonderful storytellers, and they're wonderful world builders. And there's a lot to be taken in from people, even that aren't part of your genre. And so I would say to anybody out there, get involved with a group, meet people, learn from people, find people that are different from you in terms of your writing, and let them weigh in on stuff, and just try to exercise, if they give you things to do, try that process, see what they have to offer. Because for me, a big part of Downrange, and people have said, it's not just a thriller. It's a novel. It's a story about life. It's a story about relationships and love and loss. And there's so much going on here. And that's what I wanted. I wanted a good plot, and I wanted it to be fun, but I want it to be character driven as well. And a big part of that was, from relying on, people to help me build that and craft that in a way that I wouldn't have been able to do just as a person coming from the CIA and wanted to write a cool spy novel or a military thriller novel or whatever. Take in that feedback you get from people and implement it when you think it's good.
That's great. Well, where can people find you online if they'd like to learn more about you and your debut novel, Downrange?
Yeah, so I'm at taylormorebooks.com, just taylormorebooks.com. And so you can find out more about me. You can order the book through there. I've got all the links to get to it. But yeah, you can find out more about the book. And I'll do a plug for Author Bytes, AuthorBytes. I built my own website before, and it was okay, but I needed a more professional website. And these Author Bytes came in and did a bang up job, and I'm just like blown away by it. And I do tell that for authors out there, because I spent forever trying to figure out who could help me with this, because having a people that can help build that particular site that do nothing but that is very important. And these guys just knocked it out of the park. But yeah, you can find me at my website, and join me on social media. I have all the links on there that you can, and that'll give you, that's the best way to sort of find out about what's coming up, events, new books, all that kind of stuff. And, occasionally I'll travel and do a book signing or something like that. Hopefully after COVID is done, I'll be doing a lot more of that, but it's been pretty limited just given the situation. But yeah, that's where I'm at.
That's great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Taylor Moore, author of the debut novel Downrange. The novel is on sale now, so go buy a copy. And Taylor, thanks for doing this interview.
Thanks for having me on. Anytime, I'll be happy to come back if you want me to come on. So,
Okay.
no, it's a pleasure. Yep.
That's great. Thanks a lot. Now, stay tuned for a brief excerpt from the audiobook of Downrange by Taylor Moore, performed by Jeremy Arthur. Available from Harper Audio, wherever audiobooks are sold.
Garrett Cole kept looking back at his dusty white Land Cruiser, nestled between the foothills about 40 yards down the ridge. A little rough and dirty math showed he was nearly out of the safe zone and drifting farther from it by the second. He tried to squelch the chiding voice in his head, but with every step he took into the mountainous Taliban terrain, it grew more persistent. By the time he was nearing the edge of the escarpment overlooking the small Afghan village, an old line of caution boomed in his head like a honky-tonk serenade. If you get your ass in, you better get your ass out. Had Garrett been sipping on a Shiner Bock beer at the Stumblin' Goat Saloon, he might have enjoyed the melody. But the warning was no beer joint poetry dripping from the mouths of Sturgill Simpson or Robert Earl Keane. It was a little hard knocks wisdom imparted 5 years prior by a seasoned instructor at the DEA Academy in Quantico. A Georgia-born gunslinger named Joe Bob Dawson ended every tradecraft lesson and war story with one of several sayings. First among his favorites was, "I didn't get this old by accident," which was followed by a close second, "I want to meet Jesus, just not today." Either way, the message to his deep cover officers was clear. The kind of work they did was as dangerous as it gets. As a former Green Beret turned DEA special agent, Garrett had, over the years, become a devoted disciple of more than a few old hands who had been there, done that, bought the bloodstained t-shirt. And he treated their lessons like gospel. He'd been in a few tight spots more than once, and their wisdom had saved him on several occasions. Slowing his pace, Garrett dropped into the prone position and inched over a blanket of powdery snow to the edge of a crag overlooking the valley. Finding good cover behind the serrated stump of a fallen gray cedar, he lay flush against the cold granite, struggling to catch his breath as adrenaline surged and lactic acid pumped into his aching thighs. After a short rest, he rolled to his side, unzipped his brown Carhartt jacket, and jerked at its fleece lining to let a little cool air flow in. Garrett nudged the black Filson watch cap up on his forehead, raised the camera's viewfinder, and made a slight adjustment to the lens. Once the snow-capped mountain peaks were in focus, he shifted his gaze downward to a narrow but powerful mountain tributary. The meadow lining its banks was emerald green, reminding him of photos he'd seen from Ireland and Scotland. But the crown jewel of the whole view was the sky-colored water swirling over jagged gray fangs of rock. The image was surreal, like some lost valley from an ancient storybook world. In fact, it would have been a postcard-worthy shot were it not for the 24 heavily armed tangos bunched around at the creek, about 60 yards below his position. He didn't recognize them, but they were dressed in black shalwar kameez and carried Kalashnikov rifle variants with polymer stocks. Their modern rifles and tactical chest rigs made them look more like paramilitary troops than straight-up Taliban or ISIS. Of course, it was growing nearly impossible to identify anyone by guns and gear. Since the pullout of NATO forces, terrorist organizations, drug runners, and warlords were thriving, in large part due to proceeds from the opium trade. For that reason, Garrett and his DEA team were deployed to Afghanistan. The jihadi movement had grown bigger than ideology. It was about money and power, and selling the drug large-scale bought dump trucks full of both. The call to morning prayers caught Garrett's attention, and he watched the tangos drop to their knees on small maroon rugs laid out on the chalky stone. With heads wrapped in black turbans, they bowed and rose, mumbling in a low, steady cadence that carried on the wind. The hunter in Garrett liked the sound cover provided by the gale, but the rest of him cursed the damn bite of it. Garrett adjusted the lens, zoomed in on the creek, and captured a few photos of weapons and equipment. There were 3 Toyota Hilux pickups and a red Nissan 4x4 pickup with a Dushka machine gun mounted over the cab. but nothing out of the ordinary for a warlord's convoy. Several more snaps with the camera and he checked his 6. No one in sight, but a deep uneasiness set in. A burn in his stomach he recognized from over a decade of war zone tours and undercover assignments. Garrett didn't normally travel alone, but the rest of his unit had relocated from Camp Savo to another forward operating base, FOB, southwest of Kandahar. This elite squad of expert counter-narcotics and counter-terrorist fighters made up of former operators from Army Special Forces, Rangers, Navy SEALs, and Force Recon Marines had shifted their efforts to tackle opium production in the fields.